Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Paige, for sure. My name is Patrick MacQueen. I'm a real estate attorney here in Arizona. I've been doing this for 17 years. Our firm handles all sorts of commercial and residential matters, both on the transactional and on the litigation side. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest practice areas for our firm, and for me in particular, over the last 2 or 3 years has been in the areas of short-term rentals. And interestingly enough, when we scheduled this, when Melissa and I scheduled this a couple of weeks ago, we said, hey, there's some new legislation out there, and it looks like it's going to be passed. We ought to do an update, and we ought to talk about that new legislation. And I'm here to tell you that although a lot of people, including myself, thought that at least a good portion of that legislation was going to pass, it didn't ultimately pass. But we'll talk about that. We'll get there. But I want you to know that the legislation that was proposed in 2021 at the beginning of the year has not passed. It did not go anywhere. It failed. And so we're stuck with a lot of the same things that we've been stuck with, or we're dealing with the same sort of framework that we've had since 2016, frankly. So again, when we scheduled this, we thought that there was going to be some big changes. They didn't really come. And so, there's been this sort of poking around the edges of legislation that will affect short-term rentals, or it would have the effect of having a pretty big impact on short-term rentals, but it went away. So let's go backwards just a little bit. So beginning of 2020, we had 2 proposed law changes, okay, beginning of 2020, right? So Senate Bill 1554 and House Bill 2875, okay? This is at the beginning of 2020. Those did not pass. But what those bills were intended to do, so Senate Bill 1554 basically said, look, you can do 1 short-term rental every 30 days. That's it, okay? And it also gave authority for locals to have a little bit more control, local towns and cities and municipalities have a little bit more control over short-term rentals in their municipalities and their cities and towns, okay? That did not pass. That was at the beginning of 2020. That was Senate Bill 1554, again, did not pass. At the beginning of 2020, there was also House Bill 2875, and that also gave more control to the local governments and local authorities, and it required the posting of certain notices. It required noise monitoring devices. There was a new taxation scheme that also did not pass. So again, the legislation at the beginning of 2020 didn't pass, all right? We also had in 2020, this sort of great pandemic that really sort of changed 2 areas of short-term rentals. Okay, I'm trying to paint a picture of this timeline here for you guys. So at the beginning of 2020, we had the legislation that didn't go anywhere. Then we start dealing with the pandemic issues, and really the big issues in terms of the pandemic were twofold. First, cleaning policies. Those were tested because people were making allegations that I caught COVID at this short-term rental place. I caught COVID because you didn't have a good cleaning policy in place. We saw several lawsuits, and they're still continuing for people who are alleging that you didn't create safe premises and you didn't have a safe atmosphere, and somehow I caught COVID at your rental place. I think those are going to be very difficult to prove, but it sort of goes to the idea that you need to have a good cleaning policy. And if you need a sample cleaning policy, shoot me an email. I've got a toolkit. I've got a basic cleaning policy. If you ever need something like that, just let me know. But basically, you need to create a cleaning policy. You need to communicate that cleaning policy to your cleaners, and you need to ensure that they stick with it. So you kind of have a checklist of, yes, these are the things that they've done, and you're going to be in good shape if somebody ever comes out of nowhere and says, I caught COVID at your short-term rental. The second issue that sort of COVID brought up, or I don't know, enhanced or brought to the forefront, were these cancellation policies or refund policies. Okay, and ultimately, what you should have is a refund policy or a cancellation policy. Whether you have refunds or you don't have refunds, I don't really care, but have a policy. Okay. And so if you need a sample policy for refunds or cancellations or credits, a lot of people came up with the idea of, okay, well, look, I understand that you're not comfortable flying, or that this area of town or this state is kind of shut down, and so I'll give you a credit. I'm not going to give you a refund. I'll give you a credit for future use. Okay, so you just need to have a policy for those types of things. In case something else comes up. Hopefully it never does, but But those were the two big issues that we saw coming out of COVID. Again, cleaning policy, you got to have it. Refund or cancellation or crediting policy, I think those are good ideas too. So again, we started 2020 with some legislation that didn't go anywhere. We then came into these two issues that sort of COVID brought out, and that's the cleaning policies, sanitization, et cetera, and the cancellation policies. And then to add to a little bit more of this, we had some new legislation at the beginning of 2021, all right? And at the beginning of 2021, there were two new proposed pieces of legislation that came out. We were dealing with Senate Bill 1379, okay? So Senate Bill 1379 and House Bill 2481, all right? And so what we're seeing is a trend toward people poking around the edges of the existing laws, right? And under Senate Bill 1379, that passed the Senate. It was given to the House and it failed. All right, so that Senate Bill 1379, which is the 2021, which is one portion of the 2021 legislation, did not pass. But what that would have done, it would have set up a series of fines, and it would have allowed for towns and cities and municipalities to fine hosts that, number one, don't register. That it would have allowed for the imposition of increased penalties, increased fines for health and safety violations. And it would have allowed the state to revoke somebody's transaction privilege tax, the TPT license, if you had 3 adjudicated situations involving health and safety violations, okay? So there was a little bit more control by the cities and towns, a little bit more teeth to some of the state legislation. There was also a very interesting insurance requirement that was a part of this bill. And I talked to a lot of insurance brokers and nobody had a clue what the legislature really wanted to do there. But there was an insurance obligation that basically said if you're an owner or a host, you have to provide some sort of insurance that your guests can purchase if something goes wrong. But we didn't know the limits of that insurance. We didn't know really what that type of insurance was even going to be called. There was just an insurance requirement, okay? So again, did not pass. That was the legislation that Airbnb was okay with, that Verbo was okay with. And so everybody sort of thought, this is gonna pass, and this is going to change the way in which we need to address short-term rentals. It didn't pass. Okay, so we found out about a week and a half ago, ultimately failed. And so that legislation or that proposed legislation is gone. I bring it up because again, we scheduled this 3 weeks ago and this was going to be the hot topic. This was going to pass as everybody thought, but it didn't. But I bring it up because, it's on the minds of legislators, it's on the mind of the public. And so there's always a chance that it comes back at the beginning of next year, again, to kind of poke around. And so maybe there's some planning that needs to happen to avoid some of these issues in the future. We also had House Bill 2481, and that was introduced in January. And that would have had an even more significant impact on short-term rentals, okay? That one didn't pass either, but that one really would have put a hammer down on some of the owners here. And that was the one that a lot of small mom and pop owners were really concerned about. But basically, it set up, a registration. It set up a licensing requirement, essentially. And with a licensing requirement, that means somebody can come in and inspect to make sure everything is going okay. And so that would have allowed for the city to potentially come in and inspect and to confirm that everything in the license is correct and that everybody's complying with the licensing requirements. It would have also allowed for for cities and towns and some counties to change their land use planning. And that would have allowed for certain zoning designations. So for instance, if you think about it, the town of Paradise Valley could have come out and said, we're changing our zoning to only allow 50 short-term rentals at any given time in our entire town. Or houses east of 54th Street or whatever it is, are not permitted to do short-term rentals ever. And so it could have had a very, very, very significant impact on those who are doing short-term rentals. But it would have allowed the cities and towns to enforce much, much more didn't pass. Okay, so we had 1379, which is the 2021 bill, didn't pass. We had House Bill 2481. Again, that's a 2021 introduction, didn't pass either. Okay, so we want to make sure that you're aware that those didn't go anywhere. The law as it currently stands, all right, we have ARS 9-500.39, and we have ARS 11-269.17. All right. And basically those say cities, towns, counties cannot regulate except for health and safety. They can't regulate or prohibit short-term rentals. They can come up with rules for the promotion of health and safety, but that's it. All right. Now, most cities require contact information. That's okay. You must also have a transaction privilege tax license and include that reference in your short-term rental listings. And that's really it. Okay, so from a state perspective, we haven't gone anywhere. We had the law that came out in 2016, a couple of little small amendments, a couple of attempted bigger amendments, didn't happen. Okay, and so a lot of people were pretty surprised that at least one or two of those new rules or new laws didn't pass. So that's what we have at the state level, right? Cities, towns, municipalities still can't do much. Now, the issue that we see more of is short-term rentals and HOAs. Okay, HOAs can certainly govern, and one of the bigger issues that we run into with HOAs is sometimes they bypass the amendment process. So let's say that an HOA wants to create a restriction on short-term rentals. A lot of times they're bypassing the amendment process. That you usually have to amend the CC&Rs, the deed or the restrictions to prohibit short-term rentals. Well, we're seeing a lot of people trying to bypass that. They're throwing short-term rental requirements or new rules on short-term rentals into rules and regulations of the HOA. Can't really do that. I don't think that's appropriate. Okay, we're seeing improper votes on short-term rental issues. Again, it has to. If you're going to amend the CC&Rs, it has to be done usually by a pretty big majority. Sometimes it's upwards of 67% of the members. And so just a reminder out there that HOAs can certainly govern, and a lot of them are attempting to do it improperly. One of the bigger issues that we've seen over the last couple of years in terms of HOAs and short-term rentals involve the situation of somebody who's been doing a short-term rental, not a problem, been doing it for a couple of years, and then the HOA comes out and correctly amends the CC&Rs to say that the use is now prohibited. Now we want, minimum 90-day rentals, minimum 6-month rentals, minimum 1-year rentals. Okay, well, what happens to that person who was doing it appropriately, who was doing it correctly, who relied on those CC&Rs when they purchased the property? That's where we have this sort of gap in the law. Okay, I think there's plenty of law out there to support the proposition that those folks are actually grandfathered in or should be grandfathered in. When an HOA comes to us and says, hey, what is the advice? What should happen with respect to this subgroup of people who have been doing it? Now that we've changed the laws, can they continue to do it? Our advice is you should let them continue to do it until such time as they convey or sell that property. Okay. And that's the sort of middle ground. That's the way you avoid a lawsuit. That's the way you avoid going to court, is sort of coming up with that middle ground and saying, it's not ideal, but here's what you need to do. All right. It's not ideal for anybody, frankly. But this is sort of the middle of the road to continue to allow these people to sort of be grandfathered. And then, moving forward, anybody else who buys in that community. Now, what we've seen, though, are strong attempts that once the CC&Rs are properly amended, again, it has to be a proper amendment. But once that happens, we're seeing HOA boards, really go after people and say, look, that this law is or this new rule is in effect. You got to get your short-term rental out here. And a lot of people are saying, okay, fine. And they're sort of giving up on it, where I don't know that they really need to. I think that there's plenty of law and there's plenty of common law, which is judge-made law, out there to support the notion that this is something that you're entitled to continue. And so, it just depends on whether you want to get in a legal fight over it or not. But that's one of the areas that we really need some clarification. I'm of the opinion that in most circumstances, that use should be allowed, and it should be allowed to continue. But HOAs are they're well funded. They have insurance policies, and and so they're going to fight you on that. So I do have some tips for those of you who do have short-term rentals out there. And these are pretty basic tips, but a lot of people aren't following them, unfortunately. But they're pretty basic tips. And by the way, I do have a PowerPoint presentation. It's about 4 or 5 slides. You're more than welcome to have it. Sometimes when I pull up the PowerPoint presentation, it actually pulls down the bandwidth and there becomes a audio issue. And if you want any of the stuff that I'm talking about, feel free to shoot me an email. I'll post my email address in the chat when we're done here, and I'll post my phone number in case you want any of these documents. But again, if you need the toolkit, if you need the cleaning policy, etc., you're more than welcome to have that. And what I'm going to talk about now is these tips, and there's some other documents that you can have that I'm going to talk about. So first tip is I always recommend having a separate written agreement. Yes, you can book on VRBO. Yes, you can book on Airbnb. But guess what? Before you enter my house, you're going to be forced to sign this agreement and let them know that. And basically in this agreement, we're making sure that they understand that they're not tenants. Okay. One of the biggest misconceptions out there is, or misunderstandings out there is when do the landlord tenant laws kick in? And when are this is a transient lodging. And so the issue becomes, do I have to honor landlord tenant obligations, or can I kick them out and enter the property without a 5-day notice? And so if you have this separate sort of what I call a license agreement or a guest agreement, we're not calling them renters. We're not calling them tenants. We're not calling it a lease. We're calling it a license. We're calling it something other than a lease, right? We don't want to trigger any lease related words. We don't want to trigger landlord tenant obligations. So if you're an owner, always use a separate written agreement and require that anybody who wants to come to your house sign it. Okay. And again, through that document, we're getting these folks to acknowledge, no, we're not tenants. This isn't a landlord tenant relationship, because I've seen situations in which people won't leave. And then you get the police involved, and the police say, well, this is a civil matter. And then you got to go before a court and issue a 5-day notice to try to evict them. And it just becomes this long process while you're waiting for other guests to come in, and you lose revenue, et cetera. It's a big mess. So if you have this separate side agreement, you're probably going to be in a little bit better shape. Okay. And through that side agreement, there's probably 7 or 8 key things. The first of which is how we identify who's coming into our house, what we call them. They're licensees, they're guests, they're not tenants. Needs to be very clear there. Okay. Number 2 is to have a policy for guests who overstay. My favorite policy is to turn on the home alarm and blast it if they're there too long. That's always a fun one. But charging the credit cards and doing those sorts of things and getting that credit card information if you can, bolstering your whole sort of protection here, right? The third thing is to consider having an LLC. Now, I know that you probably can't do that if you're renting a room in your house. It'd be kind of impractical to sort of, say, well, the room is covered by this LLC, or the room is owned by the LLC, but the rest of the property is owned by me. I don't really know how you do that. And I've tried to talk to other people about that. I don't know that it makes much sense. But if you've got a separate property, separate and apart from your primary residence, consider having that LLC. Okay. That's usually some significant help. Number 4, we talked about this one. Have a cleaning policy, certainly. Have a refund policy, certainly, because those were 2 of the hot button topics. And if you have that agreement, then I've offered, or if you have this separate side agreement, that's a perfect place to put these things. Okay, whatever your policy is on these topics, that's where it should go. Or you could have a separate addendum. It doesn't really matter. As long as those issues are being communicated and being followed, you're going to be in good shape. You're not going to get sued. You're not going to, well, you might get sued, but the likelihood of success is very, very low. Okay. And then of course, insurance. We see a lot of people who have the incorrect type of insurance for these types of situations. And then there's no coverage, or the coverage isn't what they thought it was going to be. And so, I'm not an insurance broker. I don't know the best type of insurance, but there are specific types of policies out there for these types of situations. And I think it's well worth your time and money to pay a little bit extra for that type of for that type of policy. It looks like I've got a couple of questions, I'm happy to answer any other questions. And again, I'll put my contact information in the chat so that if you need the policies, if you need the documents, etc., I'm happy to get those to you. I'm putting it in there right now. And let's see if I have any questions. Somebody said, I got a couple of personal questions about getting the cleaning policy and the credit cancellation policies. We can get those over to you. Yeah, and somebody else wrote, and I think this is great. I used to have an insurance policy that my guests could buy or I could purchase with each short-term lease to benefit the guests if something happened. And perhaps that's what the legislation was aimed at, Julianne. I don't know. It was just so vaguely written. So fortunately, you know, if they come out with some new legislation anytime soon, that insurance requirement will be a little bit more clarified. But yeah, that's good.
I wonder if that is what they wanted. And that was really helpful to the owner too, because then they would be covered and they wouldn't ask for money back from the owner. So it was kind of nice.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was for, you know, an accidental loss or something happening at the property too, or, you know, something, you know, the ceiling fan falls on the dog or what, you know, I don't know. But and then, you know, whose insurance is triggered or whatever, we just don't know. And so I had insurance brokers looking at this thing saying, I don't know what's going to be required in this situation either.
Right.
So
right,
luckily,
that one was just for travel. That was only if they couldn't make the trip.
Right. Right.
So,
I think that's a great idea too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other part of the insurance probably would be important too, but that wasn't with that.
For sure. For sure.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. Well, like I said, I don't see any other questions, Melissa, but you know, if you need any of the items that I referenced or have any other questions, you know, perhaps about where things are headed or about your particular situation, I'm happy to answer those, and feel free to email me or give me a call when you can.
Yeah, great class, Patrick. Thank you, everyone.
By the way, we do sometimes through WeServe, and maybe we need to talk about this one, Melissa. We sometimes offer a full 3-hour CE class on short-term rentals. So if anybody's interested in that, I can talk to Melissa about putting one of those together. And we're doing pretty much everything on Zoom. I know it's 3 hours of sitting, but happy to get that going if anybody's interested.
Perfect. I'll let Tanya know that you're offering that.
Sure. All right. See you guys.
Thanks,
have a good
Patrick.
rest of your week.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.